Hi, I'm Kavita.
And I'm Widyan.
And we are The Point magazine. We take a look at how international events are impacting upon local communities in Australia.
And we also have a special focus on countering violent extremism and its role on a global scale and its influence here locally.
We really hope you enjoyed this video series. So I just wanted to start actually drawing from something that was mentioned where James talked about one of these big factors was a sense of nobility and protecting his community and identity. And I was just interested in Priscilla and your work, but also the whole panel, what you sort of see as some of the factors for young people joining up with violent extremist groups.
I think James pretty much said it all. I think it's a wanting to belong to something where they feel needed. And I think that a lot of people want to join like groups like the army because they feel like people who also want to join violent extremist groups because it makes them feel wanted and respected by society. Yeah.
And anything in your lines of work or ideas that you've had around this?
I would say that, you know, the experience of violent extremism or moving towards that is a very localized experience. One can't generalize too much.
Yeah.
It depends on your particular societal factors involved. However, there are some, I guess, parallel currents running through a number of societies involving some experience of dehumanization, deprivation, or powerlessness in some way. And you find that in a number of communities too, not just in young people moving towards violent extremism, but you find it in First Nations communities, in refugee and asylum seeker communities, migrant communities that have also experienced, communities that have experienced colonization, intergenerational trauma. You experience a lot of, you witness a lot of lateral violence going on among a lot of these groups. And that is when you have an experience of powerlessness, and deprivation, dehumanization, you tend to want to exert your power in another form.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's easier to exert your power among your, towards yourself or your own people, or people who are just easy targets. And so it becomes very appealing to find a way to exert that power. And these groups provide that opportunity.
I think that's really well put, actually. I was just interested as well, because obviously we've got this sort of the current climate in terms of the rise of far-right extremism. And I was just interested sort of again, what's happening globally. How do you see that impact at the moment in Australia through your work or through the sort of work you're doing with communities?
I think it's going back to the first question in the sense that all these experiences, they're not exceptional. They're shared across human experiences. And when the center collapses, the fringe rises. And so what happens is when a normative belief system, whether that be in secular politics or be that in religion, when that no longer is potent enough to fulfill questions and provide answers, people will look for alternatives. And so by looking for alternatives, they're trying to understand meaning. What is it that they can draw to understand meaning? And from the meaning, they grab a vocabulary that allows them to be empowered. So by having a sense, they have a very dominant vocabulary in the sense that it's us versus them. In regards to the far right, this is not a new phenomenon. It's, extremism is the oldest, it's one of the oldest crimes in humanity. Even it's mentioned in the Bible, the Zealots. This is where the first act of extremism, if you want to, is recorded in human history. And then in the 18th century becomes into the dictionary. But the point being is that far right, where does it come from? It's chicken and the egg. Is it because it's a reaction to something? It's when as I said, it's when a normative belief system collapses. So we need to look up and say, what are the factors? I believe that tackling all forms of violent extremism will not be solved through legislation. You have to really look at the social factors that are pulling apart, and this is the reason why I said why multicultural New South Wales is so critical to this, because when trouble occurs, they all come down to social factors. They all look to this. So really it is about probing and understanding why people are being deterred from a mainstream message such as being articulated by MNSW. And when that fails, we can have an understanding why people will be driven towards far-right politics or far-right Islamist sort of politics as well.
Yeah, sorry.
No, go for it.
No, I was just going to say, with the rise of Trump, for example, I think that people have kind of latched onto what he's saying and almost use what he's saying to legitimise their own feelings. I've got a report from the Southern Poverty Law Center, which is an anti-racism organisation in the US, and they said that there were 900 bias-related incidences against minorities in the first 10 days after Trump's election. So I think, you know, we've got proof that you know, what leaders in our society say really impacts on what people choose to do.
Absolutely. We often hear things when we're talking about, you know, the rise of the far right or white supremacy. We hear things like just ignore them or don't give them any airtime. But are these groups' concerns legitimate in any way? And what is the risk associated and the dangers associated actually underestimating some of these groups and the potential that they have?
Yeah, there's a lot of different discussions about that. Yeah, sorry, what was the first part of your question again?
If they've got legitimate concerns and not underestimating what, you know, their potential.
Yeah, I don't know. Sorry,
It's a bit like Islamophobia. I mean, the thing is, we had this Islamophobia report that just came out. And I think there was 243 verified reports of Islamophobia between 2014 and 2015. It's when people report them, then people will understand, and people are hesitant to report them because they don't want to be seen as causing problems, or they will say, you know, like, don't worry about it, it'll go away. You fail to forget that you are an enfranchised citizen of this country. You have every right to ensure that you have the freedom of expression and the freedom to go to A to Z without being molested. I was in Singapore and I did a lecture on Islamophobia, and they were talking afterwards, like, you know, this happened, what should we do? And I said, well, the first thing you need to do is report it, because anecdotally it doesn't do anything. People need to have statistics to have something. So it's part and process of a pattern. So the first thing to do is recognize that as a human being, you should not be tolerating this, and also as a citizen of a country, you have the inherent right to ensure that you have the freedom of movability. And in fact, in Islamic law, one of the biggest crimes against, in the Sharia, you know, Sharia, is terrorism, because it's one of the classical Islamic law speaks extensively about this, and the root of terrorism is the threat of a citizen from being free to move. I mean, this is like 10th century we're talking, that this was seen as a real sin, that God has given everyone the right to move and to be free, and they should not be able to, they should not have fear of, you know, to have restricted movements, but that's a different discussion. So.
Yeah, I just wanted to touch on the aspect you were asking about, whether some of these grievances are legitimate. I think that, look, with a lot of violent extremists, there is always some tinge of legitimacy in a personal grievance they might have, whether it's with the state or society, or maybe some injustice or a threat to their identity that they might perceive. There is some aspect of that concern that might be legitimate from their point of view. However, it's what they do with that grievance that is the concern, not necessarily that they have a grievance. And I am a strong advocate of the view that we need to engage in dialogue and allow people to engage in discussion about their grievances, and even for people who are on two, you know, opposing sides of the fence, to be able to talk to each other and engage in dialogue about these ideas. And also to connect at a human level, because beyond ideas is a human connection. And I think the human connection is what really bridges the gap between an idea and the violence itself. So I think that it's important to hear people out, but the problem is that far-right views have become so normalized and so heard out, and it's become almost prevailing rhetoric in society, in some societies, that it provides another layer of injury to people who are already suffering trauma. And people have gone through many series of injuries in their life, and when all they need is just to hear that sort of rhetoric again, and it triggers various, you know, layers of wounds that they've been carrying for perhaps generations. And so we need to approach our society and groups in our society with a trauma-informed care approach. And so it's a hard one to juggle. You want to be able to engage in dialogue and allow people the freedom of speech to discuss tough ideas and challenge those ideas in a free space. But at the same time, you need to be aware that it does hurt people just to hear those ideas. It's like a bullet being thrown at people all the time. So it's a delicate balancing act, and it's a tough one for leaders.
On your point of far-right views becoming more mainstream and more normalised, often we hear a lot about, quote, Islamic extremism or Islamist extremism. It's portrayed in the media far more than what far-right extremism is. There's this argument that Islamic extremism is much more dangerous, much more imminent, much more prominent. What are your views on that, and should we be paying more attention to far-right extremism? Priscilla, do you want to?
Yeah, absolutely, we should be paying more attention. There was an article that came out recently about the London mosque incident, and I can't remember the exact number, but there were far more news coverage when it's about Islamic-inspired terrorism than there is when it's a white guy or a group of white people. I think, and back onto your previous point, and to back up what you said, there's a popular saying, and no one really knows where it comes from, when you're accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression. And I wonder whether, particularly in Australian multicultural society, whether white young men feel that there's so much talk of multiculturalism, what is their identity and where is their place? And so that might also be what is causing them to feel like that they need to assert their power, you know. So I wonder whether, or how we might ensure that all Australians feel like they belong. I'm kind of in two minds to talk about this, because I feel like so much airtime is given to white people. So move over white people kind of thing, and let everyone have, you know, be a part of the discussion. But at the same time, what happens to the young working class man who feels like he's being oppressed? You know, it's such a complex issue. Yeah.
Anything after?
It's just interesting, I think, that in the media, speaking generally, is that they're very quick to pinpoint Muslims who are terrorists, and they're very slow to ascertain the identity of white individuals who commit an act of terror, which ends up being a mental health issue. And that's, you know, I'm very careful to say this, because it could come across as, oh, here we go again, the Muslims are blaming the media. I mean, it's beyond a joke. I mean, tell me one report that does not conclude with the same that we're all saying. So, okay, you don't like the anecdotes, you don't like the research, you don't like the proof, then what is an ideological position that you're at? It's not as if we're crying over spilt milk. This has been going on for far too long, 16 years of individuals who, many of you here were 11, 12 years old. What impact does that have of being exposed to negative messaging about your faith and your religion and a group of people? And then conversely, what does it do to the mainstream society to absorb negative messages about a faith of which most people are unaware of, but being told that you need to be very careful about these individuals? What it's creating is creating a wedge between the dominant society, be that UK, America, Europe, or Australia, and a minority. And this is causing a great deal of trauma. I think I think that was really important what she said, bringing an element of sensitivity around trauma, because while people may be upset when you talk about colonization, let's say that happened 100 years ago, the problem is that you read about it in the textbooks as history, but people are living it with it as a day-to-day life. So people are living with consequences of decisions made in rooms in Whitehall, you know, 100 years ago. So it's very real. And then global impact, local issues, because you have a diverse, multi-ethnic community that is coming from a region that is deeply traumatized by the consequences of being told that their culture is backward and the color is evil. So how does that come in there? And so there's an Arab saying that it's in the mother's milk, you know, that this is how people are taught about that. I feel that Australia and the Western societies living in a secular democratic country has benefits, and the benefit of that is that should prevent discussions on sectarian violence that has occurred and destroyed countries not to be allowed to to be brought here because the space is a public space. So I think that there are advantages of living here. And the other thing is many people fled those regions to come to this place. So the idea that Muslims are against the West, if you go to any Muslim country and ask them where would they want to live, they'll say America. Like but I thought you hate America. No, we actually like America, but we dislike certain things about that. So I think, as what you said, these issues are very, very nuanced. And going with what Asiya mentioned about, we're dealing with great trauma. But I'd like to add, the fact of the matter is, and I emphasize, that a lot of this is we're talking about minorities, and you can frame solutions in that, but we have to understand that we're talking about the human level as well. It doesn't matter if you're white or black. Hats off to Michael Jackson for his good song. But anyway, the point being is we're talking about humanity on a human plane level. And whether you come from a position of privilege or underprivilege, your blood is red at the end of the day. And so that's why I said, what happens to the fact, I'm a Muslim, so I know exactly what the consequences of me reading newspapers. But conversely, what about mainstream society? They've been told for 16 years, fear your Muslim neighbor. What does that do to them? It does create trauma for them as well. So it's about getting the balance correct, I think.
I also wanted to add in, I think we often, in my perspective, we falsely construe these discussions in a very compartmentalized sort of way. And I tend to take the view, like Aftab was saying, that if we perceive of the universe as a whole and everyone is organically connected to each other, and good begets good and injustice begets injustice, harm that's done in one area or one type of violence creates another type of harm or violence in another area. And it's almost as if this energy is feeding that one. Islamophobia, far right-wing extremism, Islamic or Muslim extremism, they're all connected in a way. And quite frankly, we have a lot of violence in our society. Unspoken violence, even among the elite privileged classes of society as well. Our country was founded on violence. We celebrate violence every Australia Day. To the great hurt and injury of our First Nations. We have violence against the earth that we commit all the time in the name of consumerism. We commit violence against young women and girls in other third world countries who produce everything that we use. And our culture is based on violence. Our society is based on violence. We produce weapons of war. We engage in warfare on a regular basis, and we justify this in mainstream society as something that we need to do because we need to intervene in these societies because they're bad societies and we need to fix them up. So look, our society, our world has got a lot of violence in it. Our children are raised on violent video games. We watch. The more violent and gory a film is, the more exciting it is. It's almost as though we get stimulated by violence. And it's like the lateral violence is occurring on a universal plane. And it's infecting us all. And for me, the only real solution to some of this is to really check ourselves at a metaphysical level and go inwards and turn to a higher self and rise above violence within ourselves and towards each other. And so I can't say I'm going to address far-right extremism on its own or Muslim militancy on its own and so forth without addressing my own violence and the violence my society does to each other and to other societies. I think it's all interconnected and we have to realize that we're not separate beings.
It's really interesting. Martin Luther King, in his Birmingham letters, he wrote something very interesting. He said, before you address the tyrant outside, address the tyrant inside. So, and it's interesting that Martin Luther King took it from a perspective of virtues. He didn't take it from the issue of black being oppressed by the white people, although during that time he would have been perfectly entitled to say that. And that is, I think, an issue, a challenge of our generation. Where does the role of virtue play in an age in which many minorities feel oppressed? And the answer, I would say, sadly, is not much. Because I would argue that most of our virtues are seen by vices as Generation Y. I've given up what Generation Z now, whatever generation it is anyway. So, but the thing is, you see, so I feel that, I think that when we talk on the plane of metaphysics and philosophy, people roll their eyes because it's so emptied from our life because of consumerism that everything that we do is inherently related to power dynamics. And the idea of a sort of universal plane doesn't really resonate with young people, because wherever they go, whether you may be a white individual drawn to far right or a Muslim drawn towards ISIS or Al-Qaeda, where this, nothing, the center is breaking down. As I said at the beginning, when mainstream narrative breaks down, the fringe will naturally rise.
Mm-hmm.
So.
I'd like to actually draw on something that Asiya, you were saying just in terms of compartmentalizing things, because I'm interested kind of in your work in this space, both as women. And I'm interested sort of, how do you think gender plays a factor, whether we're talking far right extremism, violent extremism, whatever form, what kind of factor do you find working in this field, and have your experiences been?
Well, because I only work on the far right, but I find it's fairly male-dominated, I think, particularly when you look at security services, and even most of my team are men as well. Yeah. The perpetrators are pretty much all men. There are women in the far right movements, but there's not many.
Yeah.
I find this really hard on a personal level, because reading what these men are saying, often it's against women, it's misogynistic. And to be honest, sometimes I do get a chill down my back when I have to read what they have to say. So I guess as a woman in this space, having to deal with that content is quite difficult.
That personal impact as well.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
I would agree with that. I think that women have been disproportionately the victims of violence across all societies. Including our own here, even in North Shore and northern suburbs and so on, where we have more elite classes. Women are experiencing family violence in their homes. And we experience violence in the workplace. We experience de-individuation. We are invisible to a lot of our colleagues, where sometimes it's a very tokenistic approach to women that's given as well. And that disempowers a woman. And it's only a matter of time before the lateral violence extends to women as well. And I was speaking with a colleague just recently in the earlier session, and he was saying in the Parramatta area there is a rise of female gangs. Increasingly young women are carrying weapons and so on. And I would say that's a symptom of the fact that women have been disempowered and experiencing violence in their lives, or dehumanization in their lives, some kind of deprivation, and they feel that they must rise above that and exert their power in some way.
I want to move the conversation along to something that we've already touched on, and that's Islamophobia. So I'm sure some of you have heard that earlier this month the Islamophobia report, which was a first of its kind in Australia, was released, and it showed that Australian women who are identifiably Muslim were 3 times more likely to experience an Islamophobic incident. And I wanted to share a couple of some of the other findings, which state that 98% of the perpetrators were identified as ethnically Anglo-Celtic, as indicated by the report, and that most victims who reported physical assaults occurring in New South Wales was at 60%, compared with Victoria at 26.7%. And I want to, ask the panel, are you at all surprised by these figures and the findings of these reports? And does it shock you? Aftab, do you want to?
No, it doesn't shock me. In 2013, I taught a course at the Lebanese Muslim Association, plugged it for you, there you go. So, on a class on Islamophobia, and I taught several classes, and that when we got the feedback, that received the least positive review. I still remember reading them, and it was for 2 reasons. One, most people said, it doesn't apply here. We really do not have it. And the others said, oh, we know about this already. But in the presentation, and in class, it was raised like, this is quite irrelevant. They said, look, we liked your other lessons, we don't really like this. And in the lesson, I showed an arc. I said, look, it's going to come. And I said, and this is how it's spreading. And I drew all the examples, I gave the statistics, and I said, it will come. And when it comes, it's going to hit hard. Now, are you ready for that? So no, it doesn't. As somebody who reads statistics all the time, who actually hates mathematics and all these things, but it's unfortunate I have to do this, because when you make a case, anecdotes don't really cut it, unfortunately. So you have to prove, and whether it's America, whether it's Great Britain, whether it's Europe, or whether it's Australia, they all point to the same thing, and that is the fear of the unknown, this ignorant predicated on ignorance, that people have a fear of the unknown. And also there is institutional issues that one needs to look at. So in a nutshell, it does not surprise me. Unfortunately, it does not surprise me, because this is what's known. This is a trend that has been occurring for the last 10 years.
Can I just pick up on something you said? So the course that you were teaching was to Muslims about Islamophobia, is that right?
Yeah, it was a course. It was called the Positive Intellect Project or Program. We have a debate about to this day. I don't know what it was, but and it was the last. It was one of the preemptive penultimate courses. Widyan was in that course as well, I think, and it was teaching them that these are. I was trying to. The point was to try to think out of the box. So I'm saying, look, this is how one needs to articulate it. This is how people perceive Islam, Sharia, Muslims. And Islamophobia was one in which I said, look, this is a global trend. I remember having conversations, they're like, oh no, it doesn't affect us here. That was 2013.
Yeah.
And I said it's gonna inevitably happen, unfortunately, because it's a human issue, it's a human problem. And I had many discussions about that. And once or twice I spoke about it in public realms, and where there were non-Muslims, they were like this. And it was this idea that, the Muslims are victimized. And so it's really difficult to get this balance. You're trying to communicate a lived experience by showing hard evidence. And people feel you're attacking them. And you say, like, I'm not, if you feel I'm attacking you, we're in big trouble. We're trying to communicate between two groups of individuals who are at loggerheads, and for what reason. So.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying in terms of Muslims, though, saying that Islamophobia is not going to come or it's not going to hurt them, because I see that a lot in everyday racism work. And I think it's a form of self-protection. Yeah. People saying, well, I've never been a victim of racism. And I find that so hard to believe given the statistics. So I think it's natural for people to say, this isn't going to affect me, or this doesn't hurt me.
Yeah, but it's like, I'm not racist, I have a black friend.
Yeah.
Because the thing is that one hopes to think that they don't capitulate, but racism is very easy to fall into. And same with Islamophobia, in the sense that people, as Asiya said something really important, that people have deep trauma, and you may not even be aware of it. And hearing something, it can be very, very discomforting for somebody to hear, and then people will misread that and saying, look, why are you getting so upset about it? So again, it's hair triggers all the way. But when I did teach the course, I provided the statistics from America, England, Europe, and Australia. Over 55%, and one of the most extensive research reports done in Australia, it revealed over several years, 55% of Australians have a fear of Muslims. And this fear in America, Great Britain, Europe, and Australia, when non-Muslims were asked, they always overestimated the population of Muslims, always. Why is that? Because this idea of this horde of Muslims are coming in. In the first question was asked about Brexit. As soon as Brexit happened, attacks went up over the roof the next day. In fact, there was a person, it was so hilarious, but it was very sad. And he was walking down the street, and he had his British passport, and he was showing everybody and kissing it, like, I'm okay, I'm okay. Everyone was laughing, but this is what was going on. So it is a human condition that is perpetuated by ideologically driven initiatives and agendas. It's true, it happens. But the question is, how do we overcome that?
I want to...
At times, I should caveat that.
Maybe a complicating factor is, the internet now, and the free flow of all sorts of ideas and fake news and fake facts as well. So people exchange a lot of things that are not really true.
Yep.
But the more it's exchanged, the more it goes viral. People believe it's true. And so this idea, the old ancient notion of the Muslim hordes coming to invade, has sort of had a resurgence because of this information exchange. Even though there are no statistical facts to back that, there is a perception that it is true because of how much it's shared online. And so.
Absolutely. I want to ask, when I think of Islamophobia, I think of a fear of Muslims or a fear of Islam, but we can't ignore the global context, and especially with this idea of the war on terror. Where do these fears stem from, and are some of these fears rational or are they irrational? You can go for it.
Well, a phobia is a classic definition of a phobia is an irrational fear. And the far right would say, well, we don't have an irrational fear of Muslims because they're beheading everybody, so we fear that. And then you have an argument that would say that, and Muslims would argue that you are actually quite racist towards Islam because your institutions are inherently biased towards or against people of color. So it's interesting, but I would say, and argue quite politely, because I don't like arguing too much, it's a rhetorical word. But I feel that, look, it's just, I think the default position is people don't want to go on killing people. They just want to live comfortable lives. You know, they just want to mind, I'm British, we like to mind our own business, right? It's like, whatever, you know, have a good day, even though it's raining all the time over there. But I think that the fear of Islam has a rational component and an irrational component. It has a rational component because if for 16 years you're reading the Daily Telegraph, you're like going to fear Muslims. Like one of them was the tentacles of fear. Like what does that mean? It's an octopus got hands everywhere. And then it says jihad in prison max, which basically even in the most secure institutions, people are plotting jihad. Like that's going to scare people. So on one level, if you think it on a linear plane, it is very logical. But it's also irrational to think that out of 600,000 Muslims that live in this country, 1.6 billion Muslims that live on the earth, if you took all the Muslim extremist group in the world, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and whatever you have today, it would be 0.00083%. That is irrational, but nobody wants to talk about a reasoned discussion. And that also comes into the case talking about this idea that the media is portraying Muslims and you've got to fear them constantly. So it's creating these entrenched ghettos. You have the Muslims who think that the non-Muslim society is inherently against Muslims, and then you have the non-Muslims who don't have Muslim friends who think that Islam hates us. And if you're liberal, if you're liberal non-Muslims, you're just polite towards Muslims because although I'm not too quite sure about your culture, I do like the manouche and the kebabs. Thank you very much. But please stop killing us. Something like that. So that's the liberal biasness coming in. So it's we like your food, but not so much your culture.
I was interested because we talk a lot, obviously, about blame in these issues. Who do you think's responsibility it is when we work on combating Islamophobia?
Well, the Islamophobia report, if you read it, it was 108 pages. It starts, the first section were 8 mini essays, and the second section, we're looking at the analysis. I think they had a very good conclusion. They said there's 3 areas of responsibility. The first one was government. And it said the government has a responsibility to ensure that the environment that breeds Islamophobia is not there, i.e. legislation. And many minorities will agree to that. The second conclusion it said was that mainstream society needs to create spaces where minorities are able to be free and enjoy the benefits of being minorities. And the third aspect, which is probably the most controversial in regards to the Muslim community, is that Muslims need to do more outreach work. There's a group of Muslims that will think that's irrelevant because coming to know one another, it will not diffuse Islamophobia because Islamophobia is inherently hardwired into the system of a secular liberal democracy. That's a different conversation. But basically it's saying everyone's got a responsibility to share. And I think it's not all for the government to share. It's not all for Muslims to share. I think it's an important, as you said to your point, it's an important conversation because, look, people fled Syria and Middle East to come here to flee persecution, and they come into a country where their religion and their culture is being targeted. That's not healthy. And non-Muslims are being fearful of Muslims and not really knowing why, because it's this invisible biasness, this invisible prejudice comes in, day out, this drip feeding of being told about Muslims and Islamic culture. So I think it's across society, but definitely, the government would argue, and I'm speaking as a non-government, it's not the government official position, but the government would argue saying that legislation will not solve the issue, but legislation will help facilitate this, as you said, this trauma that people are experiencing. So the report concludes, and I think it's a very good conclusion, it's across society.
Priscilla,
Yeah, I think that, I think we all know here in this room that often Muslim communities are expected almost to speak up when something happens. I think that is quite ridiculous. I think part of the reason why we're in this situation is the history of Australia, the racism in Australia, and therefore I personally think that white people should be much more heavily involved in doing this type of work. I don't think anyone really says that, but I think, you know, I'd like to see more white people stepping up and saying, you know, this is a problem, this racism is a problem, institutionalized racism is a problem, systemic racism, that's, you know, and until that really happens, I'm not sure, and until they say it and believe it and do something about it, I'm not really sure we're really going to get anywhere.
I think it would, as Aftab said, I think there are a number of areas of responsibility and a number of actors that can play a role, but I think it would help a lot if there was an acknowledgement that Islamophobia exists. I think it would reduce, or it would be a trauma-informed practice to at least acknowledge the pain of the people that are on the receiving end of Islamophobia. That this is a real injury that occurs in their lives. It is not a made-up construct. It is not their imagination. It is not their victim mentality. It's something it's a real lived experience. And to just acknowledge that would make a world of difference. And, you know, to validate the fact that they are injured people as well. They're carrying around these injuries, and they have to go on and pick up and live their lives and become positive, contributing members of society in spite of these injuries. In spite of, you know, every time you hear a news story, it drains you when you're a survivor of Islamophobia. Every time you hear your workplace colleagues talking about Muslims, it's an injury to you. Your neighbors deciding to avoid you on the street, it's an injury. Like there's so many ways, you know, bullying in schools. Little children in kindergarten are experiencing Islamophobia at a very subtle level from their peers and from their teachers. And these are lived experiences that accumulate. And so people become very sensitive over time to them, and it becomes a very painful lived experience for them. And so we're not trying to justify Islamophobia, I think, would be counterproductive. But just to acknowledge, yes, this is a lived experience for people, and they shouldn't have to live that experience. It is an injustice towards these people, because they're innocent. An ordinary innocent child is an innocent child that hasn't done any harm to anybody. And somebody who's just going about their workplace business, trying to become a contributing, positive, functional member of society is just an ordinary person like you or I. What they wear is what they wear, what they choose to wear. They shouldn't become a victim of ostracism or skepticism or stereotypes or labels because of that. So I think acknowledging that at a policy level, if rhetoric of politicians could change to acknowledge that as well, it would make a huge difference to the Muslim communities that are on the receiving end. And I think that would encourage a lot more cooperation and trust building as well.
I'm mindful of time before we go to Q&A, but I wanted to speak to you, Asiya, a little bit about your work in Nigeria and working with young victims of Boko Haram. What are there ramifications of overseas conflicts on local communities here, and how are these conflicts playing out locally, and how has it informed your work that you do here as well as overseas?
I think there are a number of layers of impacts here. I would say that what happens in the news media affects people here. People become concerned. For example, the kidnapping of the Chibok girls was a big concern globally. Raised a lot of attention on the plight of victims of terror there. So people have impacts in that sense, maybe raised awareness of what's going on when it's displayed on the media. And people who have experienced conflict in their own lives, or maybe their families have experienced conflicts, they also can be triggered by stories of conflict overseas. And for me, as someone who has worked with survivors of terrorism and massacres, I am a lot more aware of trauma and intergenerational trauma. But I'm also a lot more aware of resilience, and I've been so impressed by, the orphans I work with, because, bless their hearts, they have experienced in their young lives, and these orphans are the ages of 2 to 12. They have witnessed their parents destroyed, and in some cases entire villages destroyed. And yet these children are still doing good, they're rising above. And a very normal response would be to react against the world and to become inflictors of violence themselves. And when they fled from their homelands, they fled to areas in which they were additionally traumatized by the host communities, who would sometimes tease them, oh, you don't have parents. They were impoverished. Sometimes they had to become like slaves inside somebody's home just to survive. So they had layer upon layer of trauma, and yet what these children love to do most is if you give them a bag of clothes and say, what do you want to do with these clothes? They will take just one piece for themselves, and the rest they will give away to others, because they're so aware of the plight of other people, and they're aware of misfortune. They've seen so much suffering that they're particularly sensitive to that. And we continually feed that these children are good children. And I believe in that Ubuntu philosophy, that you keep reminding people, you are good, you are good. You are a higher self. You can rise above violence. You can rise above this, what society has done to you. And if you return evil with something better, you become, leaders, leaders of your future generations. And these children have gone back into their host communities that committed violence towards them and traumatized them, and given out foodstuffs and clothing and other apparel. And they come back feeling great. Their self-esteem has been boosted because they have risen above the violence that was inflicted upon them. So it has taught me a lot about resilience. It's taught me about the power of the self to rise above, the natural instinct to, fight back fire with fire. And in many cases, we have seen the tremendous educational growth in these children. They've become literate in 1 month, literally. And they have excelled in all their spheres of activity because they have opportunities to. Once they're provided a loving, nourishing environment, they just thrive. And so it has taught me that the human condition is such that when it is exposed to injustice, if it's just left without nourishment and care, it can go in any direction. Some of these children were becoming street thugs and so on, and they were just behaviorally erratic. But in 1 month of love and care, they're thriving beyond anything imaginable. So the human condition is such that the human soul is one in which, if you provide the right nourishing, supportive conditions, if you acknowledge, I know where you came from, your parents are good, you are good, and we will give you the opportunities to fulfill your life purpose in being good and doing good, they can rise above all of that. And I believe, any group can rise above some of the things that it has been subjected to as well as a group, if only it is allowed the right conditions to thrive. But we have a long way to go in our society in providing those conditions. I mean, look at our First Nations here, who are continually deprived in their own communities. They're deprived of the right to self-determination. Now, if they were provided the right to determine their own lives, to organically develop their own solutions, within those communities, they have got their own internal networks, the philosophy, the structures, and the systems to thrive and to rise above their own conditions. But when we impose our own solutions upon them and we expect them to fit and conform into our systems, it doesn't work. And so we have to validate and acknowledge the indigenous philosophies and structures within a particular group of people that allow them to thrive and derive their own resilience. And I think that goes a long way.
So I'm just conscious of time as well. And what we're going to do now is actually throw it over to you guys. If you have questions, we've got a couple of roving mics, I believe. So just, put your hand up and we can start fielding questions. Up the back.
Thanks, that was a really interesting discussion. I've probably got 2 comments, and there's, I guess, an inherent question there about the panel's view on those comments. First of all, around Islamophobia. Sorry, my name's Gaith Crane. I'm here from behalf of the Muslim Women's Association, and I've been in this space for quite some time. I have a problem with the label, because I think now the label is limiting what the problem actually is. Inherently, Australia has an issue with racism. When we keep going on about Islamophobia, it gives people an out. Because if I haven't done anything which is against the Muslim, I immediately now just sidetrack the whole issue of what's happening to the Muslim community. If we look at the history of Australia, what's happened with the Indigenous community, with Asians, with every new culture that comes along. You know, when I talk, sometimes people say, but you know, it's happened to the Greeks, it's happened to the Yugoslavs, you'll get through it. And I say, you know what, that's actually the problem. This is a system of national hazing that every community has to go through. How is this a good thing? How is it a good thing that we force every new culture to go through a process which in a work environment would be bullying and we would have a real issue with it, but we force every culture to go through that. That's the problem. It just happens to be for Muslims at the moment. My second comment is in relation to the issue about government that Aftab was talking about. The solution isn't legislation. We know from organisational psychology and group dynamics you can't force through rules a change of culture. A big function of culture is leadership. And political leadership drives the culture in this country, where we have prominent members of parliament who attend right-wing functions, and nobody comes out and says, you know what, that's not an okay thing to do. That drives a culture. When we have tabloid newspapers every single day, the moment a Muslim comes out to talk about Muslim issues, as we've seen with Yasmin Abdul-Najid, as we've seen recently about the law course at Sydney University, the moment a Muslim wants to talk about Muslim issues, they are hounded, and no politician comes out and says, you know what, that's not okay. That drives a culture. Government needs to, and this is a real challenge because, you know, it's about them sticking their head up and putting their head on the chopping block. But politicians need to step up because they're the ones who actually drive culture. So, interested on your views.
I think the first part of your comment is described in the US as a baptism of fire. That many of the minorities that came into America, if you see The Gangs of New York, brilliant movie by the way, you can see what happens when the Catholics came in, the Irish came in. So and when I used to teach the Islamophobia class, I would refer this to them and said, that doesn't mean it's okay. This is a human problem that needs to be broken. And so as regards to what you said about Islamophobia, Islamophobia is both hated, it's despised, and it's loved. It is appreciated and loved because for many Muslims, it summarizes the reality of their day in and day out lived experiences. For the critics of Islamophobia, it's a fig leaf. What it does, it basically it shuts down communication, or it's felt by widest mainstream society that it shuts down any criticism of Islam. The problem with that is that there's a difference between criticizing and mocking, which is another discussion. And I think, so I personally would probably use anti-Muslim sentiment or bigotry. Bigotry should not be tolerated in any culture, any place. Although one politician did say, you know, we support bigots, but I'm not going through that discussion anyway. And as regards to the culture, which is really important, what you mentioned about political leadership, there was a report that was released a few months ago by Dalil Mogahed, who's Yasmin Mogahed's sister. And she came up with some very interesting statistics. And she said in the report that was, what was analysis of the report was that it wasn't terrorist effects, it wasn't terror events in and of themselves that created a spike in a backlash. It was political rhetoric, which I found really interesting. So it wasn't terror attacks that allowed people to respond in kind, to a lesser degree of course. It was basically the rhetoric that came from political leadership that creates an environment in which anti-Muslim bigotry is okay, as you said, normalized. So this is what we really got to challenge. I don't disagree with any of the comments you said, basically.
Yeah. Do we want to take another question?
Hi, Steve Moore from High Resolves. I just wanted to say a big thank you to the panel. It's a really interesting discussion. I really loved it. And also, just well done to Kavita and Widyan there for the video, which I found really, really interesting. Particularly seeing the white male perspective on these things. Hearing what you're saying about a lot of airtime to that as well. But that was helpful for me too, just to show that it's not kind of a their problem, it's an our problem, and really these are human problems. And that also makes me hope that there will be human solutions for it. These solutions are inside us and that we can produce them. And so building, what Asiya was saying, recognizing that we're all human beings, so we can rise of a higher self above these things. So what I just was wondering is, from the video we saw that a lot of the root causes here can start quite young. What are some of the things, just open to the panel, anyone, recognizing there's no silver bullets, but what sort of things could we be doing for our young people to help them view themselves as part of a single human race and move past those differences and recognize and maybe empathize better with people that they might view as being different instead?
Priscilla, do you want to? Asiya, go for it.
There's so many things we can do. Well, from a religious and spiritual, let's say, philosophical standpoint, there's a lot of messaging within scriptures, within ancestral traditions, and within tribal customs, and so on, that point to virtues, seeing the human rights of other people, and recognizing everyone's human condition, human suffering, and the need to assist, the need to provide benefit in society, the importance of public interest, objectives of a higher society, and so forth. These are all constructs that are universal in a way across all religions, across all tribal groups, and so forth. So that messaging can be done from a very early age in the educational and spiritual upbringing of a child. And of course, the way in which we connect as human beings to each other, some of these type of gatherings where we come across people from different backgrounds and ways of approaching things, and just connecting at a human level. Just sometimes it's as simple as just having a cup of tea with somebody. And I'll just give you just a quick example. I don't want to take too much time, but I once engaged with in an online discussion with a Reclaim Australia member, and
Sounds fun.
yeah, it was, well, look, online is a different reality, right? So people can be very antagonistic online, whereas in person they would not be as antagonistic, because in person you have eye contact, you have tone. She said, Asiya, you're not like other Muslims. I said, how many other Muslims have you met? And she hadn't met any. It's all been in the online world. And she had produced a whole Facebook page and a website anti-Islam based on her interactions with Muslims in the online space.
Wow.
And I said, look, perhaps what you need is a little bit more one-on-one, contact with Muslims, because out there we can create in our minds a construct. I had in my mind what a Reclaim Australia member would be some crazy mad person, and you seem like a normal human being to me as well. And she said, oh yes, all of us are normal people. We're all really nice. You should meet Kim Vuga. And she's really and I'm sure you are nice people, and a lot of most Muslims are nice people too. Maybe we should just meet over a roast one day or something. And I said, just invite me to one of your barbecues. I don't mind if you're barbecuing pork that day. Just, it's not going to scare me away. Just invite me. And she said, yeah, I want to invite actually all the Reclaim members here to the mosque. I said, don't all come at once. Don't all come at once. But I'll be happy to give you guys a mosque tour. I fully believe that one-on-one human contact is really important, and sometimes it breaks down some of the the ideation, the imaginations, and the constructs that we create in our minds when we don't have that human connection. There's a lady, Mahbooba, from Mahbooba's Promise. She has open house days in her house all the time on the North Shore. She invites homes, and she invites people to come, wealthy ladies from the North Shore to come into her homes, and other ladies invite their houses and invite Muslim women to come and have a cup of tea. And I believe in England too there was
tea and biscuits.
Tea and biscuits worked pretty well as well. Sometimes it's just these little things, just little chats, that it's not the tea itself, but it's the fact that you establish a human connection beyond what goes on in your mind, because when we mull over things and we overthink things, our minds can create all kinds of crazy notions about each other. But we can get outside of our heads and into each other's realities if we just connect on a physical level. So I think that's important too.
Thanks.
More questions? Any more questions from you?
Yeah.
Surely there's one more question.
We had a bit of a discussion on the panel about, division of how many information there is about Islamic incidences compared to white supremacy incidences. In regards to resources that we're allocating just in this room or representation on the panel, do you feel that we need to have a much more equal or much more accurate representation of resources and representation? I'm just wondering how you guys feel about that.
Maybe I should just give a typical not-for-profit answer. Yeah, absolutely. Altogether Now is now one of only 2 organisations in Australia that focus on racism. So I think it's particularly difficult working on this issue primarily, well, for many, many reasons, but number one, I think, is that anti-racism work is long-term work, and that is not really what gets funded. What gets funded is the emergency things that are happening right now. I can see that you agree. So absolutely we need to focus on, countering violent extremism and all these different things, but I think what's underlying all these issues, violent extremism, Aboriginal rights, the policy issues we have with asylum seekers, or not with them, but the policy issues that we have, underlying all of that is racism, but we're not dealing with racism. So they're going to continue. So I think we really need to start thinking about how we're going to, as a society, how we're going to manage racism, how we're going to fund it, how we're going to encourage people to take action. Yeah. What else can I say, really?
Are there any other views? Or
I think, do you want to contribute? No? I think we have time for one more question. Yeah, here.
Bilal.
I think the mic's just coming to you. Yeah.
Thank you. First of all, this has been so insightful. I've learned so many things today. I just wanted to say, we've talked about young people and then not feeling as part of society, not feeling as belonging and things like this. And one thing that I'm seeing recently with being one-on-one in the front line with these young people is a lot of them coming back from school talking about how the teachers are telling them that, oh, you're struggling. I don't feel like you can keep going with school. You should just get out and drop out, and sign out, and encouraging them to sign out rather than giving them the support that they need to, get, because they're facing all of this, like you guys said, all this trauma and all these experiences at the same time, learning about themselves and their developmental stages, and here they are on the side, through the education system being taught, and I've seen it in so many. It's just I'm seeing this reoccurrence. Constantly young people coming and saying, my teacher's telling me to drop out, and this is a young person who's attending. Their attendance is at 90-95%, and they're going to Saturday schools in order to cope with this. And what can we do about this? That's my question. What can we do to change this? When they're going through all of these issues and at the same time being told that, sorry, you're not good enough.
So support systems within education as well as society? Yeah.
I think, this is where sometimes systemic issues again come up, because our teachers in our schools are so overstretched and drained that they don't feel that they can do any more support than they're already doing sometimes. And our teachers are underpaid, they're under-recognized, they're expected to go and do a million things in the curriculum. Now they're expected to be part of CVE programs and this and that as well. There's just so much burden on teachers that sometimes that human mentoring connection that a teacher can play for a student is removed, because their minds are concerned with a million other things as well. They just don't want another burden. And and a lot of young people have said this in consultations as well, that they feel the relationship they have with their teachers is being undermined all the time. They don't have that connection with the teachers anymore. And that's such an important connection growing up, to have that older person believe in you, your teacher, someone in your life, a mentor, a guide, a peer, to say, I believe in you, and even if you don't believe in yourself, go on my belief in you until you do. And that's really, really important for a young person to have that person. And our teachers aren't able to play that role, as even if they'd like to, they're finding themselves too stretched to play that role anymore. It's a systemic problem, I think.
Aftab, do you have any final comments?
No, I think it's an issue of culture, issue of resources, and my son came back from school. He had to argue with his teacher for him to for her to mark. He's only what 14, 15. Mark his essay. So he was saying to me, he received 13 out of 25, and he was said I put in a week's worth of work in there, and the teacher was saying one thing, and then when she looked at it, she gave him 23 or 25. He came back to me and saying, look, this is really strange that I shouldn't have to tell my teacher to pay attention to marking my sheet. Now he wants to move school, but
that escalated quickly.
I'm happy to do that as well. But no, I think it's there's systemic issues that one has to look at, and you can look at from both. If the culture, because when I came in 2012, I was told the same thing. In 2012, I was told by young Muslims that we're told we should become tradies or something. What do you call them? Tradies. Yeah. And don't go to university. And I thought they were joking, but increasingly so. So there's a culture that is that needs to be addressed. And certainly there's also resources that sort of perhaps maybe is pushing this, an overload of teachers' work, I guess.
Yeah. And there's only so much training a teacher has time for. Cultural competence training, diversity training, and all of that. It's very limited exposure a lot of teachers come into the workplace with. And so there's a lot of biases that are still inherent in a lot of teachers.
Absolutely.